Beneath a scorching sun, Sergeant Michael Hayes freezes as he spots Rocky Bennett, his old K-9 partner, reduced to a skeletal shadow beside a mysterious old man. What secrets do those haunting amber eyes hold from a blood-soaked battlefield? A sudden clash erupts, cracking open a door to a shocking truth. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. The sun clawed at the earth, a relentless tyrant hurling golden spears through the crowded park. Laughter pierced the air, children shrieking with joy, vendors barking their wares, families weaving through the chaos like threads in a fraying tapestry. But for Sergeant Michael Hayes, time had stopped. His boots, polished to a mirror sheen that morning, rooted themselves to the cracked pavement. His chest tightened, a drumbeat of dread pounding beneath his ribs. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had seen too much, locked onto a sight that ripped the breath from his lungs. There, at the edge of the bustling path, an old man slumped on a splintered bench, his gnarled hands clutching a frayed rope tied to a dog. No, not just a dog, a ghost. A skeletal frame draped in matted fur, ribs jutting like the jagged peaks of a war-torn ridge. The creature lay motionless, its head resting on paws that trembled faintly with each shallow breath. But those eyes, amber flames flickering through the haze of neglect, those eyes burned into Michael's soul. He knew them. He'd seen them in the dark, under gunfire, through blood and smoke. Rocky Bennett. Rocky Bennett, he rasped, the name a prayer and a curse tangled in his throat. His voice barely broke the hum of the crowd, but the dog's ears twitched. Slowly, agonizingly, its head lifted, those familiar eyes meeting his. For a heartbeat, the world dissolved. No children, no vendors, just a man and his shadow from a life left behind. A weak whimper slipped from Rocky Bennett's cracked lips, his tail thumping once, twice against the dirt. A flicker of life, a plea. Michael staggered forward, his knees buckling as he dropped beside the dog. The scar, he saw it now, a cruel slash along Rocky Bennett's flank, pale and jagged like lightning frozen in flesh. A wound earned in hell, a badge of honor from a night Michael could never unsee. His hand hovered, trembling, inches from that matted fur, afraid to touch, afraid to believe. "I'm here, boy," he whispered, tears clawing at the edges of his voice. "I found you." But then a shadow loomed. The old man lurched to his feet, planting himself between Michael and Rocky Bennett like a wall of weathered stone. His face was a map of creases, etched with suspicion, his grip on the makeshift leash tightening until his knuckles whitened. "What do you want with him?" he snapped, his voice rough as gravel, laced with a defiance that didn't quite mask the tremor beneath. "He's mine." Michael's head snapped up, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. "Yours?" The word tasted like bile. "You don't know him. You don't know what he's been through, what we've been through." His fist balled at his sides, nails digging into his palms as memories surged, unbidden and merciless. Gunfire echoing through a shattered village. Rocky Bennett's growl cutting through the chaos, blood soaking into sand. He swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing his voice steady. "His name's Rocky Bennett. He was my partner, my family." The old man's eyes narrowed, uncertainty flickering like a dying ember. "Family?" he spat, shaking his head. "He's been with me for months. I fed him when he was starving, patched him up when he could barely walk. Where were you then, huh? Some family." The accusation landed like a punch, and Michael flinched, guilt twisting like a blade in his gut. Where was he? Fighting bureaucracy? Burying himself in silence while Rocky Bennett suffered? "I didn't know," Michael said, his voice cracking, raw and desperate. "They took him from me, promised he'd be cared for. I begged to keep him, but they—" He stopped, choking on the words, the betrayal still fresh, still bleeding. His gaze dropped to Rocky Bennett, who watched him with those haunting eyes unblinking, as if waiting for an answer Michael didn't have. "Please," he said, softer now, a plea stripped bare. "Just let me explain. You deserve to know who he is. Why I can't walk away again. The old man hesitated, his grip on the rope slackening just enough to let it sag. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him like water through cracked earth. For a long moment, he said nothing, the park's clamor swelling around them, children's laughter now a cruel mockery of the tension hanging in the air. Finally, he sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside, his voice barely audible. "Tell me, but if you're lying, I swear." Michael nodded, his jaw tight, his heart hammering as he sank to his knees beside Rocky Bennett. His fingers brushed the dog's fur, tentative at first, then firm, tracing the familiar contours of a body he'd once known better than his own. Rocky Bennett whimpered again, leaning into the touch, and Michael's chest caved under the weight of it. Relief, grief, rage, all crashing together like waves against a crumbling shore. "I'm so sorry, boy," he whispered, tears spilling now, hot and unashamed. "I should have fought harder." The old man shifted, his shadow still looming, his silence a challenge. But Michael barely noticed. His world had narrowed to the dog at his feet, the dog who'd once stood between him and death without a second thought. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a reckoning. Somewhere beneath that matted fur, behind those amber eyes, lay the truth of Rocky Bennett's abandonment, a truth Michael would claw from the earth if he had to. Because this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a fight neither of them had seen coming. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the park, Michael knew one thing for certain. He'd burn the world down before he let Rocky Bennett slip away again. The park faded, its laughter and light swallowed by a darkness that clawed at Michael's mind. He knelt there, fingers buried in Rocky Bennett's matted fur, the dog's shallow breaths a tether to the present. But those amber eyes, those damn eyes pulled him under, dragging him back to a night when the world was fire and ash, a night that broke them both. His grip tightened, knuckles whitening as the memory roared to life, unbidden, unstoppable. Afghanistan, the village, the mission that carved that scar into Rocky Bennett's flank and into Michael's soul. It was past midnight when the call crackled through the radio, sharp and urgent, slicing through the barracks' stale air. "Insurgents, abandoned village, weapons cache, move out." Michael's unit, 6 men hardened by years of dust and death, geared up in silence, the kind of quiet that hums with dread. Rocky Bennett paced beside him, tail low, ears pricked, his German shepherd frame taut with purpose. They'd done this dance 100 times. Michael with his rifle, Rocky Bennett with his nose, a pair forged in the crucible of war. But that night, something felt wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too deep. They slipped through the desert like phantoms, boots crunching softly on sand. Rocky Bennett leading the way with a hunter's grace. The village loomed ahead, crumbling mud walls, roofs caved in, a graveyard of forgotten lives. Michael's pulse hammered in his ears, sweat beating under his helmet. "Stay sharp," he muttered, more to himself than the team. Rocky Bennett's growl rumbled low, a warning only Michael could read. Then it happened. The explosion tore the earth apart. A deafening roar, a flash of blinding white, and the ground bucked beneath them. Michael hit the dirt hard, his helmet cracking against stone as debris rained like shrapnel from a vengeful sky. Screams pierced the chaos. His men, his brothers. But the gunfire drowned them out, a relentless staccato ripping through the night. Ambush. They were everywhere, shadows with rifles, eyes glinting in the dark. Michael scrambled for cover, his rifle barking as he returned fire. But the world spun, a kaleidoscope of smoke and blood. "Rocky Bennett!" The name tore from his throat, raw and desperate. Through the haze, he saw him, his partner, his lifeline, crumpled near a shattered wall, a dark stain spreading across his fur. Michael's heart stopped, a scream trapped in his chest as he crawled, belly down, bullets zipping past like hornets. Every inch was agony, every breath a gamble, but he had to reach him. He had to. When he finally did, the sight gutted him. Blood, too much blood, pooled beneath Rocky Bennett, a shard of jagged metal buried deep in his side. Those amber eyes, wide and wild, locked onto Michael's, unyielding even in pain. "Stay with me, boy," Michael choked, tears mixing with the grit on his face as he pressed his hands to the wound. Warmth seeped through his fingers, slick and relentless. But Rocky Bennett didn't flinch. He whimpered, soft and broken, yet his body shifted, shielding Michael from the hail of bullets still tearing through the air. Loyal to the end, always to the end. "You're gonna be okay," Michael lied, his voice trembling as he fumbled for his medkit. "I've got you!" Gunfire roared closer, two insurgents flanking them, their silhouettes stark against the flames. Michael's hands shook, slick with blood, but Rocky Bennett's growl snapped him into focus. The dog lunged, wounded, bleeding, defiant, teeth bared as he took one down, giving Michael the split second he needed. 2 shots, 2 bodies. Silence fell, heavy and surreal, broken only by the crackle of distant flames and Rocky Bennett's ragged breathing. Reinforcements stormed in moments later, medics shouting, hands pulling Michael back. But Rocky Bennett fought them, claws scrabbling against the sand, straining to stay near him. "I'll come back for you," Michael promised, his voice cracking as they dragged him away. Rocky Bennett's eyes held his until the dog collapsed, a hero spent, his blood staining the earth they'd fought for. That night, Michael swore on everything he had left, that they'd never be torn apart again. But promises break. Systems fail. And somewhere along the line, he'd lost Rocky Bennett to a betrayal he couldn't foresee. The flashbacks shattered, spitting him back into the park's golden light. Michael blinked, tears streaking his face, his hands still pressed against Rocky Bennett's scar. The dog stared up at him, quiet now, as if he'd lived that night all over again too. "You remember, don't you?" Michael murmured, his voice thick with grief. Rocky Bennett's tail thumped once, weak but sure, and Michael's chest caved under the weight of it. Love, guilt, rage, all tangled in a knot he couldn't unravel. The old man's shadow shifted nearby, his silence louder than words. Michael barely noticed, his world consumed by the dog at his knees. That scar wasn't just a mark, it was a vow, a debt unpaid. And now, with Rocky Bennett trembling beneath his touch, Michael felt the truth clawing its way up his spine. Someone had thrown this hero away. Someone had let him rot. His jaw tightened, a spark of fury igniting in his gut. Whoever they were, they'd answer for it. He looked up, meeting the old man's wary gaze. "He saved my life," Michael said, his voice low, steady, a blade honed by memory. "And I failed him once. Not again." The words hung heavy, a bridge from that blood-soaked past to the fight simmering just beneath the surface. Rocky Bennett whimpered softly, leaning into Michael's hand, and in that touch a silent pact reformed. They weren't done. Not yet. The war wasn't over. It had just found a new battlefield. The park's golden haze clung to Michael like a shroud as he knelt beside Rocky Bennett, the dog's frail warmth grounding him against the storm raging inside. Those amber eyes, still fierce, still unbroken, held a mirror to the war they'd survived, a war that hadn't ended with the gunfire's echo. "Not again," Michael had vowed, the words a steel thread stitching past to present. But vows were fragile things, and the truth gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. Someone had betrayed Rocky Bennett. Someone had turned a hero into a ghost. His fingers tightened in the matted fur, a lifeline to the fight he knew was coming. The old man's voice cut through the haze, gruff and unsteady. "You say he saved you? Fine. Prove it." His weathered face was a mask of doubt, but his grip on the rope leash slackened, dangling like a lifeline between surrender and defiance. Michael's gaze flicked up, hard as flint, meeting the challenge head-on. "Prove it?" he rasped, the weight of memory fueling his words. "That scar on his side, shrapnel from an ambush that should have killed me. He dragged me to safety, bleeding out, while bullets tore the world apart. That's who he is. That's why I'm here." Silence stretched, taut and brittle, the park's chatter fading to a distant hum. The old man's jaw worked, chewing on Michael's words, his eyes darting to Rocky Bennett's scar, a jagged testament glinting faintly beneath the grime. "He's been mine," the man muttered, softer now, almost to himself. "Found him half dead, limping through alleys. Fed him scraps, kept him breathing." Guilt shadowed his voice, a crack in his armor, and Michael seized it. "You saved him," Michael said, forcing calm into his tone despite the fire in his chest. "I owe you for that. But he doesn't belong on the streets, scavenging to survive. He belongs with me." He stood, slow and deliberate, towering over the bench but keeping his hands open, a gesture of truce. "Please, let me take him home." The old man stared, torn, his fingers twitching on the rope. Then, with a sigh that carried years of weariness, he let it fall. "Take him," he croaked, stepping back, tears glistening in his rheumy eyes. "But don't you dare let him down again." He patted Rocky Bennett's head once, a farewell, and turned away, vanishing into the crowd like a wraith. Michael's breath hitched, relief crashing against the guilt that still clawed at him. He'd won. But the war wasn't over. He scooped Rocky Bennett into his arms, the dog's weight a frail shadow of the muscle he'd once carried. Every step to the truck was a battle. Rocky Bennett's whimpers slicing through Michael, his own legs trembling under the strain of memory and rage. Home was a small apartment, a sanctuary of quiet after years of chaos. He set Rocky Bennett on a blanket, hands shaking as he brushed dirt from that scarred flank. "I'm here now," he whispered, voice breaking, "never letting you go." But Rocky Bennett flinched at the touch, eyes darting, distrust flickering where loyalty once burned. Michael's heart sank. Trust was a casualty of abandonment, and rebuilding it would be a fight of its own. Days bled into nights, a blur of gentle persistence. Michael coaxed Rocky Bennett with food, fresh meat, not scraps, watching him nose it warily before eating. He groomed him, untangling knots with a patience he'd never known he had, each stroke a silent apology. "Remember the barracks?" he murmured, recounting old missions, old victories, hoping the words would bridge the gap. Rocky Bennett's tail flicked, a ghost of a wag, and Michael clung to it like a lifeline. But the scars, physical and hidden, told a story of neglect that wouldn't fade with a soft bed or a full bowl. Then he found it, tucked inside Rocky Bennett's worn collar, beneath layers of grime. A faded tag glinted, a name, a number, a whisper of the past. K-9 Relocation Services. Michael's blood ran cold. This wasn't random. This was a trail. He scribbled the details, fingers trembling with a fury he could barely contain. Someone had processed Rocky Bennett. Someone had dumped him. The next morning, he dialed the number, each ring a hammer against his skull. K-9 Relocation Services, a curt voice answered, clipped and hollow. Michael gripped the phone, knuckles white. "I'm looking for info on a dog. Rocky Bennett, German Shepherd, military, K-9, retired." A pause, then papers rustled. "Yeah," the man said, bored. "Processed him years back, transferred to a contractor. Vanguard Security Solutions. That's all we've got." Michael's jaw tightened. "Transferred? To who? Why wasn't he placed with me?" The man bristled. "Not our job to play matchmaker. He was old, injured, out of service, out of our hands." "Out of your hands," Michael snapped, voice rising, sharp as a blade. "He ended up starving on the streets. Who the hell is Vanguard?" A grunt, then reluctance. "Private outfit, security gigs. That's all I know. Take it up with them." The line clicked dead, leaving Michael seething, the name, Vanguard, burning into his mind like a brand. He glanced at Rocky Bennett, curled in his corner, frail but alive. "They did this to you," he muttered, fist clenching, "and they're gonna pay." He drove that afternoon, Rocky Bennett safe with a friend, the address from Vanguard etched into his GPS. The compound loomed like a fortress, barbed wire curling atop high fences, guards in black tack gear eyeing him like prey. Michael flashed his military ID, voice steady despite the storm inside. "I'm here about a K-9 you handled." Rocky Bennett. The guards hesitated, then waved him in. Inside, a woman in a crisp suit greeted him, her smile a thin veneer over steel. "Sergeant Hayes," she purred, too smooth. "How can we assist?" "Rocky Bennett," he said, leaning forward, voice low and lethal. "German Shepherd, served multiple tours, saved my life. You took him, then dumped him to die. Explain that." Her smile faltered, just a flicker, before hardening. "He was unfit for service. Too old, too damaged. We tried to place him, but—" "Bullshit," Michael cut in, slamming a fist on her desk. She flinched. "You threw him away like trash. A hero. My partner." Her eyes narrowed, cold and unyielding. "We follow protocol, Sergeant. If he couldn't work, he wasn't our concern." "Not your concern?" Michael's voice trembled with rage, barely contained. "He gave everything. For us. And you let him rot." Before she could reply, a whisper from an aide pulled her away, her exit a dismissal. Michael stormed out, fury boiling over, the truth crystallizing in his mind. Vanguard wasn't just careless. They were complicit. A system that chewed up heroes and spat them out. He'd reclaim Rocky Bennett's honor, no matter the cost. This wasn't over. It was war, and he'd just fired the first shot. Michael's truck roared down the highway, the Vanguard compound shrinking in his rearview mirror, but its barbed wire shadow clung to his mind like a curse. He'd fired the first shot, words sharp as bullets, aimed at a system that bled heroes dry and left them to rot. Rocky Bennett's frail form flashed in his thoughts, those amber eyes a beacon through the fury boiling in his veins. This wasn't just about one dog. It was about all of them. Every K-9 discarded like spent shells. He gripped the wheel, knuckles white, a vow hardening in his chest. He'd tear it all down. Back home, Rocky Bennett greeted him, slow, tentative, a tail wag breaking through the haze of distrust. Michael knelt, pressing his forehead to the dog's, breathing him in. "We're not done, boy," he whispered, voice rough with resolve. "They don't get to walk away." He pulled out his phone, fingers flying. Contacts, veterans, journalists, anyone who'd listen. He snapped photos of Rocky Bennett, scars stark against his fur, ribs still sharp under healing flesh. Evidence, ammunition. Each click fueled his fire. Each scar screamed for justice. The campaign ignited fast. Posts online, raw, unfiltered. "This is Rocky Bennett," he wrote. "Saved my life in Afghanistan. Left to starve by Vanguard Security Solutions." Comments flooded in. Shock, rage, tears. Veterans chimed in, voices from the trenches. "My dog too. Same story. They dumped mine in a shelter." Michael's jaw tightened. A pattern, a plague. He dug deeper. Records, emails, whispers from old squad mates. Vanguard wasn't a fluke. It was a machine, reassigning K-9s, pocketing funds, then cutting them loose when the profit dried up. Days blurred. Phone calls, late nights. Rocky Bennett by his side, stronger now, his bark echoing through the apartment, a war cry reborn. Michael met a whistleblower, ex-Vanguard, eyes hollow, hands shaking. "They didn't care," the man hissed over coffee, voice low. "Dozens of dogs, shipped off, abandoned. I've got files." He slid a USB across the table. Proof, names, dates. Michael's pulse raced. "Why'd you keep this?" The man shrugged, bitter. "Guilt. Couldn't sleep." Michael took it, a weapon heavier than any rifle he'd carried. The fight escalated. He leaked snippets, documents, photos, to a journalist friend, Sarah Coleman. She dug in, relentless, her voice crackling through the phone. "This is big, Dan. Systemic. I've got sources corroborating." He paced, Rocky Bennett watching, tail thumping. "How soon?" he demanded. "Days," she said. "Stay safe. They'll push back." Push back they did. Threats came. Calls, shadows outside his window, a brick through his truck's windshield, glass shattering like gunfire. Michael didn't flinch. He'd faced worse. Rocky Bennett growled, hackles up, ready. "We've got this," Michael muttered, ruffling his fur. They were in it together. Then the high noon hit. Sarah Coleman's expose dropped. Front page, online, everywhere. Vanguard's betrayal, the fate of America's K-9 heroes. Photos of Rocky Bennett led the charge. Scarred, defiant, alive. Leaked files spilled secrets. Contracts voided, dogs vanished, money trails snaking to private accounts. The internet erupted. Chakuji Justice for K-9s trended. Veterans marching, families raging, hashtags carving a battlefield of their own. Michael scrolled, breathless, Rocky Bennett's head on his knee. "Look at this, boy," he said, voice trembling. "They see you." Vanguard scrambled. Press releases, lies about isolated incidents. Lawyers swarmed, suits crisp, voices smooth. But the tide turned too fast. Protests hit their gates, signs waving, voices chanting. "Honor our heroes!" Michael joined one, Rocky Bennett at his side, leash taut. Cameras flashed. A vet in a wheelchair saluted Rocky Bennett, tears streaming. "Thank you," he choked. Michael nodded, throat tight. This was it, the reckoning he'd promised. High Trow Dondap. Government stepped in. Investigations launched. Hearings scheduled. Vanguard's CEO grilled on live TV, sweating, stammering. "Negligence," the senator snapped. "Abuse." Michael watched, fist clenched, Rocky Bennett curled beside him. A call from Sarah Coleman, urgent, triumphant. "They're folding, Dan. New laws coming. Care for retired K-9s. Mandatory placement. You did this." He exhaled, shaky, relief warring with rage. Victory, but not enough. Not yet. Night fell, heavy and electric. Michael sat at his table, papers strewn, testimonies, plans, a fight unfinished. Rocky Bennett padded over, stronger now, his nose nudging Michael's hand. Those amber eyes gleamed, trust rebuilt, spirit unbroken. "We won a battle, buddy," Michael said, voice low, fierce. "But the war's not over." He pulled up a photo, Rocky Bennett in his prime, mid-leap, fearless. Then another, scarred, frail, but standing. 2 lives, 1 soul. The world saw him now, but Michael knew the scars ran deeper than headlines could heal. Outside, the city buzzed, protests fading, lights flickering. Inside, a spark flared. Vanguard was bleeding, but others like it lurked, shadows waiting to strike. Michael's gaze hardened. He'd exposed one beast. He'd hunt the rest. For Rocky Bennett. For every dog left behind. The climax wasn't an end. It was a call to arms. And as Rocky Bennett rested his head on Michael's lap, warm and steady, Michael felt it. The fight had just begun. The city's clamor faded to a hum as dawn broke. Pale light spilling through Michael's window, bathing the room in a quiet glow. Rocky Bennett slept at his feet, a steady rise and fall of fur and scars, a living testament to battles won, and battles still echoing in the silence. The fight had raged, a tempest of headlines and hashtags tearing Vanguard's lies apart. New laws stood like sentinels now. Care for retired K-9s, homes promised, justice carved from the chaos Michael had unleashed. But as he stared at the dog who'd sparked it all, a weight settled in his chest, heavy and unresolved. Victory tasted bittersweet, laced with questions no law could answer. He ran a hand along Rocky Bennett's flank, tracing that jagged scar, the one from that night in Afghanistan, the one that bound them through blood and fire. "We did it, boy," he murmured, voice soft, frayed at the edges. Rocky Bennett's eyes cracked open, amber glints piercing the haze, and his tail thumped once. Slow, sure, a heartbeat of trust rebuilt. Michael smiled, faint and fragile, but the spark from their war lingered. The fight had begun anew, Sarah Coleman had said, and she was right. Vanguard was bleeding, but shadows stretched beyond its ruins. Other companies, other dogs, other betrayals waiting in the dark. Autumn crept in, crisp and golden, when the invitation came. A ceremony, Heroes with Paws, a non-profit born from their storm, honoring retired K-9s. Michael loaded Rocky Bennett into the truck. The dog's steps stronger now, his coat gleaming under months of care. The park bustled, veterans in faded uniforms, families with adopted dogs, kids darting through the grass. At its heart stood a bronze statue, a German shepherd, head high, eyes fierce, mid-stride toward an unseen horizon. Beneath it, words etched in stone. To the loyal who served without question, protected without hesitation, loved without limits. Never forgotten. Michael approached the podium, Rocky Bennett at his side, leash loose but steady. The crowd hushed, a sea of faces, some tear-streaked, some saluting, all waiting. He gripped the edges, knuckles white, and took a breath. "When I found Rocky Bennett," he began, voice low but caring, "he wasn't just a dog. He was my partner, my savior. He pulled me from death in a village half a world away, and they repaid him with abandonment." His gaze swept the crowd, landing on Rocky Bennett, who sat tall, scars glinting in the sun. "I failed him once, let him slip through a system that didn't care, but he forgave me." A ripple of murmurs, soft and reverent. Michael's throat tightened, memories flashing, gunfire, blood. Rocky Bennett's whimper in the dark. "That forgiveness," he continued, "it's why we're here. Not just for him, but for every K-9 who gave everything and got nothing. They're not tools, they're family. And we owe them more than headlines or statues. We owe them homes, lives, loyalty." He paused, eyes burning. "Rocky Bennett taught me that wounds heal, not with time, but with fight." With love, applause erupted, loud and raw. But Michael raised a hand, silencing it. "This isn't the end," he said, voice sharp now, a blade through the quiet. "Laws change, but systems don't. Out there, dogs like him are still waiting, still forgotten. We've won a battle, not the war." He stepped back, the crowd surging forward, kids petting Rocky Bennett, veterans shaking his hand, a woman whispering, "He's a hero." Michael nodded, chest tight, but his mind churned. How many hadn't made it? How many scars lay buried beyond his reach? Later, as dusk painted the sky in streaks of fire, Michael and Rocky Bennett walked a quiet trail, leaves crunching underfoot. The air was cool, sharp with the scent of earth and endings. Rocky Bennett trotted ahead, tail wagging, a spark of the soldier he'd been. Michael trailed, hands in pockets, savoring the peace, but it was fleeting. "You're my hero, boy," he said, voice catching as he knelt, pulling Rocky Bennett close. The dog licked his face, warm and sloppy, and Michael laughed, a sound both broken and whole. "Always will be." They crested a hill, the town sprawling below, lights twinkling, lives touched by their fight. Michael's gaze softened, but a shadow lingered in his eyes. Rocky Bennett stood beside him, solid and real, proof of redemption, but not completion. Somewhere out there, a dog whimpered in an alley, a tag jangled with no one to call. The system bent, but didn't break, not yet. He'd saved Rocky Bennett, sparked a movement, but the cost, the years lost, the lives unclaimed, gnawed at him, a wound no statue could heal. He pulled out his phone, thumbing through photos, Rocky Bennett leaping in training, Rocky Bennett bleeding in that tent, Rocky Bennett now, scarred but standing, two lives woven into one. "We're not done," he whispered, more to himself than the dog. Rocky Bennett nudged his hand, warm and steady, and Michael felt it, a bond beyond battles, a legacy beyond laws. Love had lit their way, but the darkness still whispered, "What about the others?" As they headed home under a starlit sky, Michael's steps were firm, Rocky Bennett's beside him, a rhythm of resilience. Their story wasn't just survival, it was a call, echoing into the night, a promise half fulfilled. Justice rolled forward, but its wheels turned slow, and in that slowness, a question lingered, sharp and unshakable. How many heroes still waited, unseen, unsaved? The wind carried no answer, only the rustle of leaves and the quiet strength of a dog who'd never given up. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough, for now. Michael and Rocky Bennett's story isn't just a tear-soaked reunion or a battle that shook a corrupt system to its core. It's a reminder that loyalty and love can pierce through the darkest shadows. From the anguished days on the battlefield to the moment they stood beneath a fiery sunset, fighting for the forgotten heroes, we witnessed the raw power of resilience and hope. Yet the question lingers, how many more Rocky Bennetts are still out there, waiting in silence? Join us to uncover more heart-wrenching tales, untold secrets, and the journey to honor these four-legged warriors. Hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel. Every subscription is a voice for the silent heroes, a step closer to true justice. Sign up today because their stories deserve to be heard, and you deserve to be part of this incredible ride.